So okay, I think I'll leave it here for you.
其实可是我会用英文，因为我的中文是还算还好，以前是比较好，就是8年的时间会忘记很多。So, named Aaron Fart, members of the Apache Software Foundation, also part of the incubator. And I have, it's part of what I've done in Apache is part of the incubator. I've mentored the Open for Business, or OFBiz project through the incubator. I'm currently a mentor of Apache Heraldry, which is an open ID project. And I'm also involved with some other Apache projects, including the Apache Labs and Apache Excalibur and Avalon. This is one of the first projects that I'm involved with. I'm also involved with a software startup, and I'm currently residing in Hong Kong. I just moved there recently, and so hopefully I'll have a chance to come back here to Taiwan regularly. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Apache Software Foundation, but just a little bit of information, since sometimes there's a bit of confusion about what Apache is. It's a U.S. nonprofit organization, and the primary goal of the Apache Software Foundation is to provide legal and infrastructure support for the open source projects. So by infrastructure support, we mean basically providing the servers and the mailing lists and keeping everything up and running, and provide a legal umbrella to protect the open source developers. It is a completely volunteer organization, and we have over 1,000 committers in Apache projects and over 200 members. The members being the core body of the Apache Software Foundation. And we have over 30 open source projects. Mostly Apache is known for the web server. Apache also has a number of other projects in other programming languages, primarily being Java. Some of you have probably heard of Apache Tomcat, or Struts, for example, is a Java framework. But there's a lot of XML projects. Apache has been involved in projects from languages like Tcl and PHP and a number of other things. So it's a rather diverse community. Now, this talk is aimed at, we gave a similar talk at OSCON, Open Source Convention, last year in O'Reilly, and I'll be giving another version of this talk this year in ApacheCon EU in Amsterdam, ApacheCon Europe in Amsterdam in May. And the purpose of this talk is primarily to help people understand the role community plays in open source projects. Who here is involved in an open source project? 有没有人要加入一个 open source project？ 有兴趣 joining open source project? Anybody interested in growing their open source project? Okay. Some of you might actually also be interested in the Apache incubator. And so this talk is primarily just broken up into two parts. One, we're going to talk about community, and then we're also going to talk about the role of the incubator in Apache and what the incubator does. So, communities. We're going to talk about which community. When we talk about communities, 社区有很多，所以哪一个 ？Which community? Why? 为什么 community 社区那么重要 ？What? 社区是什么 what are we really talking about? What are the important aspects? And then how do we grow? Which community? So, if we look at it for an open source project, we have lots of different types of communities that are on from not very involved to very involved. So we have the public, who may or may not even know about it, and then the developers who worry about it all day long. And when we say, well, we want a community, well, which community do we want? Do we want this community to get bigger or strong, or this one? I mean, obviously we want strong community all around. well, what is the core that we're looking at? Well, to answer that, let's look at how these communities can be organized. In a commercial project, a commercial software project, we often have this kind of situation. We have the developers who are over here, separate, and the users of the software who are also separate. Okay? The developers are paid to work on the project, and they may or may not use it themselves. And the users have no way to really become developers except by being hired by the company. Open source projects allow these two communities to start to come together. And you have people who are both developers and users of the community who are contributors. Okay. The real goal in Apache primarily is to take the two communities and bring them together, and then grow this core community and break down the barriers between them. Because in Apache we believe that the developers should also be users of the software. Okay? We have a phrase, you need to eat your own dog food. Okay? It means that as a software developer, as an Apache developer, I would use this software. I don't work on it because I'm paid for it, or I don't work on it because someone else has asked me to. I work on it because I'm interested in it. So this is the type of community arrangement we're looking for in Apache. And at the core, we have developers and contributors. And this is the center of the community. And it's the place where you need the strongest, most open and diverse community that you can have. Because it leads to sustained activity and growth. So why is this core community so important? So, you can see that over. So here we have factor of success, and here we have time. In the beginning, code is very important for a project. The quality, if the software works, for example, will attract people. But over time, it's the community that really drives the success of a project. Isn't a very scientific graph, but it's shown very often in that eventually there is a lot of very good software that has very good code that no one uses. There is no community around it, and the code becomes dead. No one's using it. It's not very successful. It doesn't matter how good the code is if you don't have people using it and maintaining it. There's an example. So, everyone knows Wikipedia? Wikipedia? Okay. Who has ever looked at the code for Wikimedia? Okay, Wikimedia is the code for Wikipedia. Okay, it's horrible. Okay, it's not that great. I mean, it's really, really difficult code to get through. In the beginning, it was never really intended to deal with the scale, the size of Wikipedia. But it has a huge community that allows it to do things that are really impressive.
Looks like a house of cards inside.
If you've ever seen the original SourceForge code, you would know the same thing. But it's the community that can help take code that is, code of any degree of quality, and can maintain it and bring it out. There are people that argue, the Linux kernel isn't necessarily the greatest kernel from an academic point of view, but it has a community, and that community is what drives it. I want to spend some time talking about what we mean by communities. So this is a definition of community from dictionary. I know that's small, we're not going to read it, but there's some words that I want to look at. Primarily, the community is a group of people who potentially may have some sort of system of ownership. They'll have shared values and responsibilities and share common attitudes, interests, and goals. It comes down to this. A community is made of people. You have customs or responsibilities, a set of values. You have ownership, and you have shared goals. People. In Apache, we are primarily working with individuals. Even though there are many businesses and corporations that are interested in cooperating with Apache, we work with those corporations through people, individuals. We do not grant, for example, access to a project to a corporation and they can assign people. We grant access to specific individuals because ultimately the community is made up of individuals and not of other types of organizations or corporations or businesses. It's the people who have personalities that will make your community. Customs. Customs can be anything from coding standards, so these are practices or rituals. They are the standards by which the community operates. They can include rules of participation. How does someone join the community? And how does this community make decisions? Ownership allows us to know who is responsible. In open source projects, obviously ownership is defined by the license. Another thing important in Apache is that the community owns the code. It's not a single individual or a small group of individuals who own the code, but it's owned by the community as a whole. And shared goals means that we have an identity and a purpose, and we know what we are, and we know what we're not. We'll come back to this because it's actually very important. So, we said that we have people, customs, ownership, and goals. There's another part of community, and that's that a community communicates. Community has a language and ways of talking. The communication is one of the most important parts of the community. In the end, we end up with a culture inside of this community, and that's really what we're building, is a culture in our project and in a project. We're going to come back to these things in a little more detail as we go through how communities are built. So we said we have these aspects of community. How do we get people? How do we make these customs? We know that they are what they are now. How do we actually do that? One of the things about people is said is we need to have working with individuals, but we need to define what the roles and expectations and qualifications are in a project. I'll give an example of that. In Apache, this is from the Apache website, and we have a document on the Apache website that defines what the different roles are that we have with users, developers, committers, members, and PMC members and ASF members. When we talk about what those roles are and what those expectations are, so it's very clear who the different types of people in our community. Apache even has a what's called a contributor license agreement. Now this is a very, very formal way to define responsibilities, but it's a way to help contributors and members of Apache understand their role and expectation. To develop customs, things that are important is that you don't want to waste time arguing how things are done. Okay? So having a set of practices, how we do things here, helps new people understand how the community operates and keeps things moving smoothly. These include, how do I submit a bug? How do I make a release? How do we make decisions by voting, for example? Things also like etiquette on the mailing list. What is appropriate behavior? A good way to define these customs is through an FAQ. So Struts has a how to help FAQ that talks about how you can get involved and how to contribute and how to help Struts. So if you have a project, you can capture a lot of your customs in an FAQ. In terms of ownership, obviously open source projects have open source licenses. But other things that are important is making sure that you have a source control system so people can check out the software, and make sure that it's non-locking. People know what locking source control is? Does anyone use ClearCase? Have you used ClearCase before? Rational ClearCase? If you have, I feel sorry for you. Non-locking means that if two people if Dan and I want to make a change to a file, we both check it out, he cannot lock it so that I can't make my change. Okay, so it means that not one person can stop everyone. If for locking, one person can stop everything. So simple things like this can make a big difference in how a community operates. Another.
If I get my changes in before you, then you get a conflict notice and you have to figure out what it's up.
Which encourages you to check in on it. Another thing that's a bit controversial in sometimes our authorship of files. Who knows Java? Java? Who's programs in Java? Anyone here?没有人吗？真的？你们是做什么的？Perl. Oh, you're all Perl. Let's see. Any sort of VB or .NET? Anything? No. Oh, good. Python. Very good. Ruby. Oh, all right. Anyway. So, author tags. For example, in Java, Java has Java tags where you have like an @author and you will say the author. And other languages have similar things in the comments. In Apache, we decided that we would not use author tags. No author tags. Now, why would we do that? Because people want to say, hey, I made this change, right? It's my change, my file, right? One reason is people change. People go away and new people come. So if, so let's say, I'm going to pick on Dan here. So Dan committed a file to the project and it has Dan's name on the top of the file, okay? Then I see a bug there, okay? I come along, I see a bug in Dan's code. No, Dan doesn't have bugs, but this time he does. And I see a bug in Dan's code. If I see Dan's name there, I might feel like I need to talk to Dan before I can make the change, okay? But if there's no name there, I can take ownership easier. It's less, I'm not going to be afraid to offend Dan by changing his code.
But certainly you'll still have a way to find out who made that change. And
Right.
you'll still be embarrassed, so it's not totally anonymous, I bet.
No, it's not totally anonymous. Still in the source control, we still know who, and there's contributor lists. So if you no author tag still means that there is authorship, but it means there's less specific control. And this has helped communities so that you don't have, you don't have feel like one person, oh, only this person knows this part of the code, and this person knows this part, and I can't touch that. It helps you share. In Apache, we tend to avoid what we call dictatorships, or projects that have one or two main developers, primarily so that the community can survive if that leader leaves. And in Apache, we try to make sure that we have lots of readers in any particular project. So, shared goals. This is really important. In fact, this is perhaps one of the most important things for developing a community. We'll talk about that. You need to have a clear identity, and when I talk about constraints, that's what I was saying about what you are and what you're not. We'll get into that a little bit more. But having a roadmap or a feature map can help you, and using your bug tracking or issue tracking can help you be able to have a place to decide what it is that you're going to do, what your goals are. Give an example. Here's no Subversion. Subversion, probably a number of people know Subversion. So Subversion is a very good example because Subversion has on their FAQ, on their roadmap, they have why does this project exist? Okay, what is it? Well, it is to take over CVS, but primarily they have a very very specific scope. Okay. If you talk to Subversion developers, they'll tell you that before Subversion became 1.0, they would have a lot of feature requests. Subversion, oh, we should do this, and oh, let's add this feature or that feature. And it was important that the Subversion developers could say no. For 1.0, we have this feature list, and the other features will wait for later. And that helped keep the team focused to be able to get the project out. I'll give a counterexample. So I was part of the Apache Avalon project, and I can pick on this because I was part of it. Apache Avalon was a project that started in '99 in Apache as a Java framework. And one of Apache Avalon's projects, one of the problems with Avalon that we faced was not having a clear identity, actually. This was the description of Avalon in '99, and it's very, very vague. I'm not going to read all of it, but basically it was, we're going to make a framework for Java. So it was very broad, and that got us into trouble later. In 2003, it changed to this, which was even more general. Here we had, at least we said, okay, in '99 we said, okay, server applications. Okay, at least we're going to do server. We dropped servers. No more servers. It can be anything. You can do servers, but you can do anything you want. And later in 2003, it got even changed more. And here it's now a complete platform. It's even more general. And by November 2004, this was the purpose of Avalon. It was a complete platform for just about anything. And that was a problem with Avalon that we had, was because it became so broad. and we had a lot of developers doing different types of things in Avalon. I mean, it was very interesting, and we had some great time and great code, but it caused friction between developers who wanted Avalon to be this or Avalon to be that. Because we didn't have a clear, concise way of saying what Avalon was not. In the end, Avalon was split into multiple projects. Some that stayed in Apache and some that left Apache, primarily to help change to maintain that type of focus. So we split the project eventually. Yes.
I have the impression that all Apache projects are, owned by the foundation, right, legally. So how do they really leave Apache?
Actually, well, that can be a little complex, but Apache actually has a, so the copyrights of the code actually belong to the individuals, okay? You keep your copyright. What it is you give a license to Apache, and that license lets Apache use it under the Apache license, okay? So the license for Apache is very broad, very, very open. So anyone can take an Apache project and fork it, can leave it. So basically that's what happened is Apache was, or Avalon was forked, and some of the forks stayed in Apache and some of them did not.
And the people who decided the forks were the developers?
Yes. Yeah. It was a...
is that a consensus driven?
It was actually. There was, I mean, it took a while. It was not a painless process. You know, some of those forks did not do very well. Some of them have. There was a fork that was a .NET version of Avalon that's actually doing very well on its own. And most of what stayed in Apache was the very stable part of Avalon, and which is now Excalibur. It was there primarily to maintain support for projects that were dependent on Avalon, like Cocoon and James and other Apache projects. There were definitely, part of this was also some individuals who weren't in complete harmony with the project, and that was another catalyst. On this idea of purpose and identity, there's a good quote that basically the difference between just a society and a community is a unity of wills. And that's really what will make the difference in your community, in your Apache project, is a unity of will, a unity of identity and a clear purpose and goal. Now, communication, we said, is important. Communication should be open, it should be consistent, and it should be archived. What do I mean by that? In terms of openness, it means that you have a lot of ways that people can communicate. So you perhaps have websites with documentation, you have mailing lists that allow people to easily subscribe, bug tracking or issue tracking, source repositories that are open. I have an instant message or a chat down here, and I have it gray because in Apache we actually don't encourage the use of instant messaging or chat. We will have it for sometimes for support, like a IRC channel for people to ask questions. But for developers, we want all discussion should happen on mailing lists, and all official decisions have to happen on mailing lists, because not everyone can be on IRC at the same time always, because we're around the world. So, or I might be at work during the day, and my work doesn't let me chat. But mailing lists allow any time and any place. So it's more open than chat is, for example. I've worked with projects that do most of their decisions here, and it can sometimes be harder to get involved because it's a higher, more time involved here than might be involved here. So we've talked about community, and we've talked about these aspects of community and how we can develop those. So how do we go from having just some code to a community? I want to talk a little bit about code, because code is an important part. These are aspects of good code, of good open source code. Okay, code that will build a community. If you want to build a community, it's good that the code is directly useful for developers. Okay? Because you'll attract developers. That's one reason why Apache is primarily infrastructure level code or server level code. It's mostly for developers. If you look at the most successful open source projects, they are about things that are close to developers. And it's possible to have good open source projects that are for average users, like OpenOffice. But they're much harder to develop a community around. Another important thing about code, if you have a project, it's really important that you can build the code easily. If you cannot compile the code, developers will be frustrated. It's good to have standards throughout the code so it's consistent on how the code is organized and laid out. Composable means the code is built in parts. Okay? One problem with some projects is that the code is one big piece, one big part. And to understand it, you have to understand the whole part. And that is hard. So if I can understand just a small part of the code, then I can help that small part and still not understand the rest. So this is why, for example, for Firefox is a good example, with plugins, as an easy way for developers to understand just the plugins. Or someone can understand the rendering engine, Gecko rendering engine, and not understand the rest because it's different parts. I mentioned a little bit of consistent. Another important part is having ways for it to be improved. Clear things of how you can help, or if the software is difficult to change or difficult to improve, then it's hard to gain a community. The other important part of going from a code to a community is having a path to contribution. And I think this is the key part, is having a path. In other words, you need to be able to clearly say, how do I contribute? And you have to answer that question. That needs to be a very clearly documented process. Primarily, how do I go from here to here? What is that path? You need to explain that to the users. You need to explain, how do I get involved? Because these people don't understand necessarily how I can get involved. You can do that by making sure that you have a wiki, for example. Very easy for people to get involved in. Or having a bug tracker, mailing lists. And another way to encourage people is, even if we don't use author tags, we can have their names in release notes. It encourages people to get involved. They can see oh, other people are getting involved, I want to be involved too. So somewhere in your document, in your project website, have a pathway to contribution, have a way to get involved.
Your slide with the long arrow with the developers here and the users over here. One back.
There you go.
This one. I know that if you have contact between this, the most extreme, the two extremes often is rough and interact with, because the developers are very impolite, very busy, and the stupid users asking dumb questions. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I think that's where a strong contributor community is important. People who are not always the most active, but answer questions on users' list. So you need to remember, just because someone isn't committing code doesn't mean they aren't part of the community. If someone answers questions on the mailing list, they are an important part of the community. These people understand the users and they understand the developers often. They are your bridge. And having contributors is important. And you want to encourage them and allow contributors a place in your community.
It's like I often feel like you should have a public relations unit to make sure there's no rough interactions, a friendly, if people have to take public relations courses to know not to get bad languages.
Yeah, it can sometimes be hard to bridge this gap, and that's why I think you need to encourage the people who are on your user list and encourage them to have ways to get involved. They may never have the time or the skill to be a full developer in the project, but they are a critical part of the community. In fact, it's a good question. When do you give someone commit access to a project, for example? So someone is contributing. When do you give them the commit bit? And that every project has different standards on that. One of the things that we found is it's important that there is some level of consistent contribution, because when someone has to work for the commit access, they'll tend to stick around afterwards. I ran some numbers, and Apache adds about 15 new committers in whole to Apache about every month. Yeah, most of those committers are for new projects coming into Apache. And talking about this, I wanted to make a note a little bit on size. Because most communities are pretty small, and they may only have 5 or less core developers. Okay. So it's not necessarily true that you need to have dozens and dozens of developers. But in Apache, we require at least a minimum of 3 independent developers. Okay, so to be able to make a release, you need to have at least 3 different people who are developers who are willing to vote for the release. Because, again, we don't want just one person making all the decisions. We have at least 3.
Product recall.
Once something's out, you can then make a new release or bug fix. But once it hits the mirrors, it's very hard to get it back. So this is another example of that. Is that about half of all the changes that were made in Linux 2.6.20 were made by about 2.5% of the actual developers. Okay, so there were 741 developers, and the top 20 made 50% of the changes. But what that means is there were 700 developers who made small contributions. Those are the contributors, and that's the power that you're looking for. So we have a little bit of time left. I'm going to go quickly through what the Apache Incubator is in the last few minutes that we have. The incubator in Apache helps projects outside of Apache become inside of Apache. Okay? And we have two main things that we worry about. The legal, making sure that the projects have the appropriate licenses and the legal standards that we have. And the other is making sure we have a diverse community. These are the projects that have graduated from the incubator. We have over 32 projects. And these are the projects currently in incubation. So there is a lot of projects working in Apache. And I think it's mostly up to date. There's probably some that have changed. Don't have much time, so I'm going to go through this quickly. But basically, the incubation process is primarily someone starts saying, do we want to become part of the incubator? And then you need to find someone to sponsor you. You need to then propose, say we're going to go into incubation and then become part of incubation. And we have processes of basically going through and joining Apache by having the commit access, clearing all the legal issues, and then learning and growing about Apache. Need to have a regular reports and perform a release, and finally you can graduate from Apache. I'm going to jump through to the end here about so one thing about leaving, what are we looking for in a group and to get out of the Apache incubator, is that it's a healthy project and that it fits into the Apache Software Foundation. And let's see here. One thing that we found was that about over 30 projects have graduated, and that the average time in the incubator is around 9 months, but it goes anywhere from 15 to 18 months. During that time, a project might only get 2 to 3 committers added to it. But it's critical to see that the project has that ability to attract new people and bring them in. So we have another talk in about 5 minutes, so I want to go back and say, just to emphasize again, these are the areas of community that we had. The pathway for contribution was a critically important part. If you have any questions about the incubator or about growing your own community, please come up and ask me, and I'll be here for the rest of the day. So, thank you.
Two questions, and
yeah.
I think they're related, but what metrics have you created to gauge the health of your community?
Right.
And what specifically do you use to define whether the project is determined healthy enough to graduate from the incubator?
So the first thing is, and I skipped through it a little bit here because I didn't have as much time, but an important thing is the legal requirements are definite. So that's pretty straightforward. Another is each incubating project has 1 to 3 mentors. And those mentors are existing Apache members who work with the project from the beginning to the end. So a lot of it is very much a subjective call by the mentors. It's really, really important. And so we trust the mentors to look into a lot of that. But there are some basics, is that there's no specific hard requirements of you have to have this many developers from this many different communities or whatever. But aspects we're looking for are a diverse community, so you have more than, usually at least 3 different kind of sources. So independent, it's not all having from the same company. Another is that you've shown that you can add 1 or more committers, that you've brought someone from who started as a user all the way through that process. And another is that you've gone through the release process in Apache, so you've learned how that release process goes. from that point, a lot of it is really subjected by the mentors. You know, we look at activity on the mailing lists. You know, are people answering questions? What degree of activity is everything happening on the developer mailing list versus the user mailing list? And at that point, it's hard to have specific metrics. There's been arguments about whether we should have some or not, but it's often not fair to, because you have such different types of communities. Some are really, really small communities, but are still worthy of an open source project, and some are really big. And so we don't have any specific numbers that we can pin to them. But the mentors are really key, and that's been a big part of it. Is we originally had just one mentor, and we've moved it to recommend to have 3, just to make sure that there's different people always have the time to be intimately involved in the project.
And all your stuff is free software, and who pays the bills? You got salaried people, how many of them?
We have, the only salary that we have now is we have one person this last year that we hired who does infrastructure full-time.
You got fax machine, telephone, off?
All of it is through contributions. Apache is through donations only. We run a number of conferences each year, and we make a certain amount back from those conferences, and that is used to support our bandwidth, but a lot of it is donation. Apache runs very, very, very limited budget. So, other questions? I'll be around, so I don't want to take up the next speaker's time, so if you have any questions, feel free to find me.